Well, thank you very much for that lovely welcome. As you have just heard, yes, I have a book coming out next March, and we're already at the shameless self-promotion stage. That is the actual title. I didn't know whether MIT Press would go for it, but yes, they did. I did a talk at a Skeptics group back in the UK a couple of months back, and the image that they used to advertise the talk, I really loved. I think that would have made a great book cover. I really do. Anyway, let's get straight down to business. What is anomalistic psychology? This is the rather wordy definition that I sometimes use. Anomalistic psychology may be defined as the study of extraordinary phenomena of behavior and experience, including, but not restricted to, those which are often labeled paranormal. It's directed towards understanding bizarre experiences that many people have without assuming a priori that there is anything paranormal involved. It entails attempting to explain paranormal and related beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors. So, as you can see, anomalistic psychology is generally taking a pretty skeptical approach to the paranormal. I mean, I actually did used to believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. It's only as I kind of learned more about the ways that the mind, we can fool ourselves, and sometimes fool others, that I became more skeptical. But one important part of being a skeptic for me is to always be open to the possibility that you may be wrong. New evidence may come along that makes you change your mind about something, and you should always be open to that, in my view. So although most of the research that we've done at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit is of this sort. It's examining non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. There is also a kind of lesser strand where we directly test paranormal claims. Now, the person in the middle there is Simon Singh, the science writer. The person on the left is Mike Marshall, who is very actively involved in UK skepticism and now works with Simon in the Good Thinking Society. And the two ladies at the front are professional psychics. They make their living from doing readings for people. And they would both claim that they can tell complete strangers all sorts of stuff about them just using their psychic ability. And they wanted us to put them to the test. And so we agreed to do it. This was back in 2012, as you can see there. Even though what I'm going to describe is not rocket science, it's a very conceptually very simple test, you still need a lot of people to do it properly. So credit where it's due, there was a small army of volunteers involved in this. How do you do it? Well, we wanted to get some volunteers to come and have a reading done. Now, if you were doing a psychic reading for a 14-year-old girl, it would be very different from one you might do for an 80-year-old man. They've got different life experiences, different concerns, and so on. So, as a partial control for that, we said we wanted all of our sitters to be female and between the ages of 18 and 30. We had 5 volunteer sitters on the day. Remember, we're testing 2 psychics on the same day. And here's 3 of them. But even with that constraint, you can still tell a lot about someone from just looking at them. If you've got one person who clearly takes a lot of care and attention over their appearance, and another person who's much more relaxed over their appearance, it's telling you something about their personality. So we wanted to take care of that as well. We had our sitters behind a screen. The psychics never saw them at any point, and they didn't interact with them. They weren't allowed to ask questions. They had to write down the reading, the psychic impressions they were picking up. And I took the precaution on every trial of saying to the psychics, were you getting some good information then? And they assured me they were. So we're all happy. At the end of the day, we invited our sitters back, and we gave them 2 booklets of 5 readings each. They don't know which reading has been done for them. But if the psychics can do what they say they can do, there ought to be one reading that stands out as having lots of accurate, detailed information? Could they pick that reading from the 5 within each booklet? Well, by the way, to pass the test at the time, we said they had to get 5 out of 5. 4 out of 5 would have been impressive. It would have been statistically significant. So how did they do? Well, Kim Whitton got 1 out of 5. That's what you'd expect by chance. And Patricia Putt got none. So no evidence of psychic ability in that particular test. This is a conceptually similar test in terms of the kind of design, but I will describe this one to you as well. This guy in 2006, Derek Ogilvie, he was riding high. He had his own series on Channel 5 in the UK, and his unique selling point as a psychic was that he claimed he could read babies' minds. Now, you might think that babies would just think stuff like, ooh, I'm hungry, or oops, I've just pooed myself. Not according to Derek. According to Derek, they had all kinds of information about how the family business was doing, about repairs that needed doing around the house, about the state of the car, all sorts of stuff. So anyway, as I say, he was doing very well. He had his own series on Channel 5 there. He had his book out. And then in 2007, Channel 5 decided they wanted to do another program with him, and this was called the $1 Million Mind Reader. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that James Randi, although he's no longer with us, James Randi had $1 million on offer for anybody who could demonstrate psychic abilities under properly controlled conditions. And the documentary makers had decided, well, this would make a good documentary. We'll put Derek Ogilvie could go for the $1 million, and we'll make a documentary about it. And so that's what they were going to do. Now, before he went to be tested by Randy in Florida, we also agreed that we would test him, we being myself and Chrissy Wilson, my PhD student at the time. So he's going to be tested by us, and then fly over to Florida to be tested by Randy. Now, the thing that you have to be aware of is that when Derek was doing his readings in his TV show, typically the parents would be present. And so they're kind of providing all kind of cues and information. He'll come out with something, and depending upon how they react, if he seems to be on the right lines, then he'll pursue that line. There is a technique known as cold reading, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second, but it's basically a technique that deliberate con artists can use to convince complete strangers that they know all about them. And obviously, if you want to set yourself up as a fake psychic, it's a very good skill set to have. So we needed to rule out any possibility of cold reading, which we both did. So just to recap, if he passed Randy's test, he would receive a cool $1 million. If he passed our test, he would get a nice cup of tea and a biscuit. Anyway, this is the test that both tests ruled out any possibility of cold reading. This is the test that we did. We got him to do 6 readings for children aged between 15 and 30 months, but without the parents present. So we had a registered childminder on set while he did the readings. Parents were then invited to come back the next day and to choose the reading which had been done for their child. Again, the same kind of logic as the previous example. There ought to be one reading there that's got lots of specific, accurate information about that family. To pass the test, 4 or more parents must choose the correct reading. If you get 2 wrong, we didn't want 100%, 4 or more would have been impressive. As I believe I was told that as he was being driven down to Goldsmiths for the test, he said, the test would be a piece of piss. Now, this is a charming British expression that means easy peasy, okay? So how did he do? That was interesting. At one point during the proceedings, he stopped doing the reading for the child and started doing a reading on the childminder. And she was really impressed. The point being, of course, that this could all be his usual technique. I'm not saying he was necessarily a deliberate fraud, by the way, deliberate con artist. I think he may have been using the same kind of technique, but unintentionally, I don't know. This is an example of a reading that he did. This is for a 2.5-year-old child, remember. Okay, this is an extract from it. It was much longer than this. The child was telling me about a car. The following could be associated with one or two cars. One car has had a wheel or tyre problem on the front driver's side. This is a 2.5-year-old. This is associated with a dark colour car. There's also a scratch or sticker on this car on the lower part of the windscreen on the driver's side. There's also been problems with that car with the rear driver's side tyre and a brake problem. On the inside of the passenger seat, there is a mark or tear beside the handbrake. A door handle doesn't seem to be working all that well. She's very detailed. There's also a noisy exhaust. The child mentioned that there is an issue with getting a car into first gear with a parent. Now, that's supposedly coming from a 2.5-year-old. Anyway, how did he do? Only one parent chose the correct reading. That's the result you'd expect on the basis of guesswork alone. And at this point, Derek was literally in tears. He was sobbing his eyes out. He's saying, that's it, my career's over. And I'm there saying, don't worry about this. None of your fans will believe us. Your career's fine. Anyway, then I won't go into the test that Randy did with him, but Randy did a test with him in Florida. He failed that dismally as well. I remember watching the documentary as it went out and thinking, they've done quite a good job here. Is this all right? But then they had to throw a crumb of comfort to the believers, and they rigged Derek up to an EEG machine, because that's science, that is. And he did another reading, and the EEG operator said, this is very unusual brain activity, as if that somehow proved he was psychic, which clearly it didn't. Anyway, and there's James Randi, no longer with us, sadly. Okay, I mentioned cold reading earlier. Cold reading is a technique that you can use. You can practice and you can convince people you've got psychic powers. It works really well. I once passed myself off as a psychic on daytime TV in Britain. One part of it relies on, it's a whole set of techniques, and I've not got time to go into all the detail, but one part of it relies on something called the Barnum effect. And this relies on the fact there are certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're saying something very profound about your innermost personality, but actually they apply to everybody. Now, it just so happened, I want you to do a bit of role play now, where you imagine I'm doing a reading for you with my amazing psychic powers, and this is what I'm picking up. I'm picking up that you have a great need for other people to like you and admire you. You do have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you've not used to your advantage. While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Disciplined and self-controlled outside, you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. At times, you have serious doubts as to whether you've made the right decision or done the right thing. I mean, you think about the opposite of these. Would anybody say yes to the opposite of these? I mean, you prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. Oh no, I love being hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. My next line is my favourite. You pride yourself on being an independent thinker and do not accept others' statements without satisfactory proof. You have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. At times you are extroverted, affable and sociable, while at other times you are introverted, wary and reserved. Just about covers it, doesn't it? Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic, and security is one of your major goals in life. Now, obviously, that's all very general, but it can be useful for padding out a reading, and there are other techniques that you can use to convince your sitter that you've come up with some really specific stuff, even though, in fact, you haven't. But anyway, I haven't got time to go into more detail on that. Okay, so that's just 3 examples of various tests. We've done a lot more over the years. Why should a psychologist be interested in this? Well, the point is that whether or not paranormal forces really do exist, lots and lots of people believe that they do. There isn't a single society anywhere on earth where people don't hold these kinds of beliefs, and where a sizable minority of the population claim they have had direct experience of the paranormal. So there's something going on there. It's part of the human condition. It either indicates that paranormal forces, at least some of these claims, are true and could not be explained in terms of conventional science. If that is the case, then we ought to just accept it and get on with it and study it. It'd be an amazing scientific breakthrough. If, in fact, the general skepticism from the wider scientific community is justified, then by studying these kinds of experiences and trying to figure out what's going on, we learn something about human psychology. So either way, it's worth taking them seriously. So the rest of the talk, it's going to be more about the non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly psychological experiences. Now, I don't expect you to even, you probably can't even see the words on there. One of the themes that runs through anomalistic psychology is the theme of cognitive biases. Our cognitive systems, the way that we process information, are amazing, but we know that there are certain biases that systematically affect the way that we do that and can lead us to misperceive things, misinterpret things, misremember things. And some of these biases might be relevant to explaining certain types of ostensibly paranormal experiences. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is a real whirlwind tour of anomalistic psychology, but there's an excellent book coming out next March. Just mention that. One of the biases is that we are all really lousy intuitive statisticians. In other words, there are lots of situations in everyday life where we have to make judgments based on probabilities, and we're just not very good at it. Now, why is that relevant? Well, that's relevant because a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, the standard skeptical counter-explanation to a paranormal claim might be, well, it was just a coincidence. So if you think about an example of somebody who has a dream, and then a couple of days later something happens in real life that seems to bear a correspondence to the dream. Was the dream some kind of psychic glimpse into the future, or was that apparent match just a coincidence? Or, particularly in the olden days, before we all had mobile phones where people's names come up, it was very common for some people to say, I know, when the phone rings, I know who's calling me before I pick the receiver up, even though I wasn't necessarily expecting a call from that person. So that's referred to as telephone telepathy. Now, when you actually think about it, you realize that coincidence must explain at least some, if not all, of the occurrences of that kind. There are over 8 billion of us on the planet. If you make the fairly conservative assumption that on average we each remember one dream per night, that's 8 billion opportunities plus per night for somebody to have a dream about something that then corresponds to an event that really takes place. And so sometimes, just by the law of very large numbers, that will inevitably happen. What would be really spooky is if it didn't. It will happen. There'll be other factors involved as well in precognitive dreams, but I've got to get through the material. Telephone telepathy. How many people do you think about in the average day? How many names go through your head and the phone either doesn't go at all or the phone goes and it's someone else? It's a non-event. You don't notice it. It's no big deal. You're just thinking about somebody and the phone goes and it's them. Ooh, spooky. Psychic connection. No. Now, psychologists have studied our poor probability estimation abilities in lots of ways. The reason for this picture is that one of the ways of doing it is something called the birthday problem. How many people have heard of the birthday problem? Put a quick show of hands if you have. Oh, no, about one. Okay. The birthday problem essentially asks you, how many people, randomly selected, would you need to collect together to have a 50-50 chance that you've got at least one pair with the same birthday? Ignore the year, just the date of the year. So if you think about it, if you've got just 2 people, you've got 1 chance in 365 that you've got a pair that match. If you've got 366 people, then we'll ignore leap years. If you've got 366 people, then you're absolutely certain you must have at least 1 pair, because if by some fluke the first 366 are all different, the next person must match someone. So there's a magic number somewhere between 2 and 366 where you have a 50-50 chance that you've got at least 1 pair with the same birthday. If you actually ask people that, They'll come out with estimates of 180, 200, 120. The actual answer is 23. And that strikes most people as being far too low, but it is absolutely the right answer. So if you're at a party and you just come across a couple of people kind of saying, "Oh, wow, it's amazing, we just find out we're the same birthday," you can be a real party pooper. People will stop inviting you to parties, but there you go. So that's one. It turns out that of research that's been done comparing people who believe in the paranormal with people who don't, it's a mixed set of results. You don't always get significant differences, but when you do, it does tend to be in the direction that the believers in the paranormal are even worse than the rest of us. We're all bad. An interactive bit. Bed, snore, dream, doze, pillow, snooze, blanket, night. That was fun, wasn't it? Right, one of the things we've got really interested in over the years is human memory, not surprisingly, because usually when you're dealing with some kind of paranormal claim, you are dealing with someone's report of what happened. You're not there at the actual time it happens, typically. Now, that raises the whole issue of, well, how reliable is eyewitness testimony? And as you're probably all very aware, the short answer is not very. There have been literally hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that have looked at this issue, typically in a forensic context. You'll have some kind of staged crime, or we'll have someone runs on from the side of the stage and screams at me and then runs off, and I get you to give me a description, and we'll find that you've misremembered all sorts of stuff. It might be more surprising that even memory for relatively simple stimuli, things that you have seen literally thousands of times in your life, can still be unreliable. So, how is the 4 typically represented on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them? Is it like this, I, or is it like this, IV? How many people think it's I? Quick show of hands. I can't see very many hands. How many people think it's IV? A lot of you. Now, I wouldn't be asking the question if you were going to get it right, would I? You got it wrong there, you lot of people. If there was anybody with their hands up for I, congratulations. On clocks and watches, but only on clocks and watches, the 4 is typically represented in that rather unusual way, with very few exceptions. Now, the thing is, it's just a simple demonstration of the fact that memory does not work like a video camera. When I asked you the question, you couldn't think back to the last time you saw a clock or a watch with Roman numerals on and zoom in on the 4. That's not how memory works. You answer the question in terms of what you think you must have seen. So what do you think you must have seen? Well, you saw Roman numerals 4. That's IV, isn't it? So that's the answer. Well, no, it's not. It's what we call a kind of an error of top-down processing, where what you believe about the world influences, in this case, memory, but it can also influence perception, as I'll show later. Right. How many of you have seen this video before? Quick show of hands. Okay, a few of you, but not most of you haven't. So this is just directed at the people who haven't seen the video before. Very simple task. I want you to count the number of times that the people in the white shirts throw the ball to each other. Ignore the people in the black shirts. Could you play the video, please? Okay, how many times? Just shout out. 14. I think the official answer is 14. More importantly, did you notice anything rather odd? A gorilla, yes. Now, how many people, be honest, didn't see the gorilla? Oh, I love you people who are honest. Thank you, sir. I'm going to play the same video again, and this time don't count, just watch the video. Now, if I were to ask you, do you think that you would notice someone in a gorilla suit walking right in front of you? You say, of course I would. It's bound to grab my attention. But it doesn't. This is a classic study by Simmonds and Shabris with a brilliant title for the paper, Gorillas in Our Midst. I love that. And it was a very powerful demonstration of something called inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is when you're engaged in one cognitive task, and even though something's happening right in front of you, you simply don't see it, okay? Now, it's a very important concept in all sorts of areas. I mean, particularly things like fatal accidents, where people just don't see something that's happening right in front of them until it's too late. But there's been a huge amount of research, as you might imagine. Oh, right. So I meant to take that slide out. Never mind. It's just an updated version. I'll show it to you. Can you play the video, please?
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
No, I mean, I did know that slide was there, really. The point being that even when I'm talking about the fact that you can miss stuff that's happening right in front of your eyes, you still miss it. You know, we all do. It's not just you guys. Now, my wife, Anne Richards, who's here tonight, she's also a psychologist. She's done lots of research on inattentional blindness, and she called me one day and asked if I had a scale for measuring the personality dimension of absorption. If you score highly on a measure of absorption, you're the kind of person who, if you're reading a book or watching a movie or even in a crossword puzzle, you appear to be able to completely shut out the outside world. You become totally absorbed in what you're doing. And she felt, and I agreed with her, that we might expect that absorption would correlate with susceptibility to inattentional blindness. And I also was quite interested because I knew from my wider reading that absorption correlates with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experiences. And so we thought, well, let's look at all of those things in a single study, single experiment. So we didn't use the gorilla video. We used a conceptually similar task. We had white and black letters bouncing around a screen, and the task was count the number of times that the white letters hit the edge of the screen, ignore the black letters. And halfway through, a big red cross moves slowly across the background. You can't miss it if you're not doing the counting task. But we set it up so that if you were doing the counting task, about half of the people who did the task failed to see the red cross. So they're the inattentionally blind ones. And as we'd predicted, they scored higher on absorption and also higher on paranormal belief and experience. We then replicated, we got the same pattern of results in a second experiment where we also measured working memory capacity. Your working memory is that kind of, if you're doing a complex mathematical puzzle and you had to hold certain numbers in mind while you manipulated others, that would put a big load on your working memory capacity. So what we found, as I say, was that people who believed in the paranormal were more susceptible to both inattentional blindness and they had lower working memory capacity. Now, this might provide an explanation for at least some types of paranormal experience. Anecdotally, when people report that something paranormal's happened, maybe there was a perfectly ordinary, mundane explanation, but they failed to spot something in the environment that would have given them that explanation. So, they claimed they were in a room on their own and a book moved from one side of the room to the other. Well, maybe there was somebody else in the room, you didn't see them? Oh, no, I'd have seen them. Well, would you? People don't see the gorilla, so who knows? Anyway, this is, and who recognizes this person? Quick show of hands if you recognize the person there holding the keys. That's Uri Geller. Uri Geller first broke onto the scene in the UK in the 1970s. I was very, very young then, and I believed in Uri Geller. Uri Geller claimed to have amazing psychic powers. He claimed that he could read people's minds, he could divine the contents of sealed envelopes, he could do all sorts of stuff. But one of the things that he claimed to do that really caught the public imagination was that he claimed that just by gently stroking metal, he could make it bend. So this would be a psychokinetic effect, if real. Now, even at the time, there were conjurers around who said, it's just a magic trick, it's just sleight of hand, there's nothing psychic involved. But a lot of people who saw Geller doing this back in the early days would say, look, I've seen him do it, and it can't just be sleight of hand, because after he finished bending the spoon or the fork or the key or whatever it was, he put it down and it carried on bending on its own. He wasn't even touching it. Now, that would be quite hard to explain. My good buddy, Richard Wiseman, is also, as well as being an annoyingly intelligent and creative psychologist and a brilliant science communicator. God, I hate him. No, I don't. He's one of my best friends. But he's also, he would be when he's a member of the inner magic circle. Not just the magic circle, a member of the inner magic circle. So he knows a lot about conjuring. And what people like Richard believed was that this was just down to the power of suggestion. The metal object wasn't continuing to bend, it's just that the suggestion had been made that it was. And so Richard and Emma Greening demonstrated that in a nice little study. They had a video of an alleged psychic, who was in fact a conjurer using sleight of hand, doing a spot of the psychokinetic metal bending with a key. And the interesting part comes after he has bent the key, apparently, using psychic powers, but really using sleight of hand. He puts the key down, there's a nice close-up shot, and in one condition, the participants hear him say, if you look closely, you'll see it carries on bending. The other condition is identical, but they don't get that verbal suggestion. Of those who get the verbal suggestion, about 40% report that they think the key carries on bending. In the other group, virtually nobody does. So it's a really big effect with a really simple manipulation. Richard demonstrated that across 2 studies. We were interested, myself and Chrissy Wilson again, in something called the memory conformity effect. This is where you've got more than one eyewitness to an event, and they discuss what they've seen with each other. And obviously, even in a forensic context, it probably makes more sense to give more evidential weight to multiple witnesses who are all giving similar accounts rather than just a single uncorroborated account. But one thing to bear in mind is when people see something unusual, like a crime or a potential paranormal phenomenon, a UFO, a ghost, the Loch Ness Monster, if they're in a group, they're going to discuss it together. Now, what can happen is one person's account can influence another person's memory. And if that first person's account is mistaken, then you end up with 2 mistaken accounts. So we wanted to look at this memory conformity effect. We borrowed the video from Richard, but we had people watch it in pairs. So they watched the video, they then discussed it with each other, and then reported back independently. What the genuine participants didn't know was that the other person in the pair was a stooge, a confederate working with us, who'd been instructed to either say during the discussion that it did carry on bending or that it didn't. And what we found was that that had an additive effect. If you were in the condition where you got the suggestion from the psychic, and then you got the reinforcement from the co-witness, we got up to levels of 60% of people reporting that the key carried on bending. It absolutely doesn't. So it's not just what happens when you're witnessing an event that's important, it's also what happens afterwards. Would help if I pressed the right button. Yes. Okay, you knew this was coming. Which words were presented earlier? Snore. Show your hands up if you thought snore was presented. Yeah, very good, correct. Chair. Don't be silly. Pillow. Yep. Dream. Yep. Night. Yep. Sleep. Yay, false memory. It's a very trivial example of a false memory. All the words on the list were very closely associated with the word sleep, but the word sleep was not itself presented. But again, a lot of people will fall for that. So I say a very trivial example of a false memory. We've now got to the point in false memory research where there are techniques that we can use to fairly reliably implant really rich false memories for entire episodes. I haven't got time to go into them now, I'm afraid, but things like being lost in a shopping mall when you were 5, being attacked by a wild animal when you were a child, knocking over the punch bowl onto the bride's parents at a wedding when you were a child, or even being involved in a serious crime that led to police involvement. Even though you weren't, using these techniques, quite a sizable proportion of people were convinced, yes, they were the people committing the crime. So there's serious stuff. Anyway, we've now got to the point where we have, on the one hand, you've got the eyewitness testimony research and the relevance of that for the reports of paranormal experiences, but also the kind of false memory research. We've got to the point now where we know what kind of variables correlate with susceptibility to false memories. It's things like dissociativity. I won't give you a technical definition, it's a very woolly concept anyway, but if you score highly on a measure of dissociativity, you are the kind of person that my grandma would have described as being away with the fairies. Also, fantasy proneness, again, a related concept. People who have very, very rich fantasy lives, often very creative. Absorption, I've already mentioned. Hypnotic susceptibility, are you a good hypnotic subject? All of those things correlate with each other. They also correlate with susceptibility to false memory, but from my point of view, the fact that they also correlate with paranormal belief and the tendency to report paranormal experiences is really interesting. Maybe some of these paranormal experiences that people are reporting never actually happened at all. Maybe they're false memories. We wanted to kind of see if we could get some more direct evidence to support that idea. We did a study, again with Chrissy Wilson, where I'm sure that those of you who are old enough, or probably even a lot of you who aren't, recognize that horrible scene. If you say to people, I can see we've got a very young audience generally here, but to people who are a bit older, who were you with, what were you doing, where were you when you first saw that dramatic footage of the Twin Towers collapsing? People are very confident. They knew exactly. I remember exactly where I was with so-and-so, and we were doing this. It's called a flashbulb memory for something that's so emotional, it's almost as if the memory is kind of burned onto your memory cells. It turns out, by the way, that even so-called flashbulb memories are not as accurate as we once thought they were. But it looked like we were doing a study of flashbulb memories. We had what we call a news coverage questionnaire. We had 5 items on it where we said, where were you, who were you with, what were you doing when you first saw these dramatic pieces of news footage? Not when you heard the news, when you saw the footage. One of them was the Twin Towers, another one was Saddam's statue being toppled in Basra, and there were various others. But there was one item on there which, although it had actually happened, a terrorist bomb exploding in a Bali nightclub, it hadn't been caught on camera. We found, in line with similar research by others, 36 out of our sample of 100 people said yes, they could remember this non-existent footage. They could tell us whether it was in colour or black and white. They could tell us whether there was a commentary to it. It was a false memory. There is no such footage. And those people scored higher on measures of paranormal belief and the tendency to report paranormal experiences. Now, one of my favorite examples of what I assume is probably a false memory is kind of alien abduction and alien contact claims. This is a kind of, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm sure you all do, or anybody who doesn't know what happens when the aliens abduct you, this is a composite description from an article by Sue Blackmore back in the 90s. This was based on her interviews with people and reading other accounts. I woke up in the middle of the night and everything looked odd and strangely lit. At the end of my bed was a 4-feet-high grey alien. Its spindly, thin body supported a huge head with 2 enormous, slanted, liquid black eyes. It compelled me telepathically to follow and led me into a spaceship along curved corridors to an examination room full of tables on which people lay. And these are the little critters that do it. They're about 4 foot high, grey, and they communicate telepathically, and they're about to put that probe somewhere interesting. She goes on, I was forced to lie down while they painfully examined me, extracted ova, or in the case of men, sperm, and implanted something in my nose. Nobody knows what these implants are for. I could see jars containing half-human, half-alien fetuses and a nursery full of silent, sickly children. When I eventually found myself back in bed, several hours had gone by. And here they are putting the implants in. I should say, by the way, these are drawings, they're not photographs. Okay, just to be clear on that. Okay. We did a study we published back in 2008 where we compared a group of people who claimed to have conscious memories of alien contact with a very carefully matched control group that included my mum, who doesn't believe she's ever been abducted by aliens. And we found significant differences on all kinds of things like dissociativity, absorption, tendency to hallucinate, and so on and so forth. All things that correlate with susceptibility to false memories. We also found a significant difference in terms of incidence of sleep paralysis. Now, sleep paralysis is, again, one of my favorite topics. We've done a lot of research, and we're continuing to do research on sleep paralysis. In its most basic form, it's just a temporary period of paralysis between sleep and wakefulness. So you're kind of lying there in that state, and you realize you can't move. It typically lasts a few seconds. You snap out of it, and you think, that was a bit weird. But you just kind of get on with your day. It's not a big deal. How many people have, you might have experienced the more vivid version of sleep paralysis as well, but if you've ever experienced sleep paralysis at all, can you put your hands up, please? Yeah, great. You need to see a psychiatrist urgently. No. You don't. So that's the inability to move. So it's just, but now, best estimates would say that about 8% of the population will experience sleep paralysis at least once in their lives, although the estimates vary wildly from one study to another. There are two subgroups that have a much higher incidence, and this is psychiatric patients and students. Now, this does make sense, in fact, when you start thinking about it, because if you have the underlying susceptibility for sleep paralysis, you're much more likely to actually have an episode if your sleep pattern is disrupted. And these are two groups with notoriously poor sleeping patterns, hopefully for different reasons. Anyway, that's the kind of basic inability to move, but there can be associated symptoms that make it absolutely terrifying. And the most basic and one of the common ones is a sense of presence. You feel as if there's someone or something in the room with you, and whatever it is, they don't mean you any good at all. But maybe you can't see anything or hear anything, but you're sure that they are there. And sometimes it starts off like that, and then it gets worse, because you might get associated hallucinations. You might get auditory hallucinations. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. You might get visual hallucinations. You might see lights moving around the room or dark shadows or even monstrous figures coming towards you and threatening you, climbing on top of you. You might get tactile hallucinations. You might feel as if something's holding you and breathing on the back of your neck. And bear in mind, you can't move. You can open your eyes, great. And one of the few parts of your body you can move is your eyes. So you can see you're in your bedroom. Doesn't feel like a dream, feels very, very real. And you've got all this really frightening stuff going on. You might have difficulty breathing. There might be pressure on the chest, and you might feel as if you've been strangled or suffocated. And another thing you might get is intense fear, which might be a perfectly reasonable reaction to all this. But there is some evidence to suggest that it might be the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with the fight or flight response and deals with assessing threats, that is overactivated actually during the episode. But anyway, it's an absolutely terrifying thing. But it's a hallucinatory experience. It feels real, it's incredibly scary, but is essentially harmless in itself. If ever you talk about sleep paralysis, you are contractually obliged to show this image. It's The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli. It was a very popular painting back in 1781, and it is a beautiful depiction of sleep paralysis. You've got the weird horse there peering through the drapes. You've got the demon on the chest, the sense of pressure. And interestingly, if you've got the underlying susceptibility, you're much more likely to have an attack if you sleep on your back than in any other position. But I mean, sleeping like in that position is just asking for trouble, isn't it, really? That's just silly. 10 years later, she's not learnt anything. She's still in the same position. One of the really interesting things for me is the way that the same core experience is interpreted across different cultures. There are well over 100 different labels for sleep paralysis coming from different cultures, and they all have kind of slightly different interpretations, even though it's the same core experience. So in Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits astride the sleeper and tries to throttle them, and that they call that being ridden by the hag. Hag-ridden, hag-rid, Harry Potter, Hagrid. Yeah. In Japan, they call it kanashibari, literally translates as bound by iron. Again, it's a nocturnal spirit attack. In St. Lucia, I love this one because it's so creepy. It's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. So do sleep well, all of you, tonight, won't you? Back in Europe in the Middle Ages, it was sex-crazed demons who would come and have their wicked way with you while you slept. The male version was called an incubus, and the female version was called the succubus. I mean, to be honest, it's difficult to say which of the two of them is the more shocked, kind of. Now, what's the link between sleep paralysis and alien abduction claims? Well, if you read any of the UFO literature, they believe, it's very commonly believed by ufologists, that the aliens can wipe your memory for most of the experience. But there might be a few telltale signs. Guess what they are? They are things like waking up, unable to move, feeling a sense of presence in your room. Basically, they're describing sleep paralysis. That's all it is. But if you're one of those very unlucky people, there's a very small percentage of the population who have the really vivid version on a regular basis. But if you are, you're likely to think either it's real, something is really happening, or I'm going crazy. And you marginally prefer the idea that something real is happening. So when you read this account from ufologists, you think, that's what's happening to me. So now the task is you need to recover that hidden memory, that repressed memory that the aliens have tried to wipe. How do you do that? You go to see a hypnotist. You get hypnotically regressed. This is based on the idea that hypnosis is some kind of magical key to unlock repressed or hidden memories. It absolutely isn't. It provides a perfect context in which narratives are generated based on imagination, fantasy, things that you've read about, heard about, prior knowledge, expectations, and so on. And then the narratives are believed to be true. We all know, even before I told you, you know what happens when aliens abduct you. So that's the memory that you end up with. You end up with a detailed, vivid memory for something that never actually happened. And it's the same techniques that are used for past life regression, which again, you can be absolutely sure we're dealing with false memories there. And also recovered memories of satanic ritualized abuse. If you go in for a hypnotic regression session expecting to recover a certain type of memory, there's a very good chance that will happen. But they are false memories. They're not true memories. Okay, another theme, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about now. just a few examples. Another theme that runs through anomalistic psychology, which I've made a few references to already, is this notion of top-down processing. When we interact with the world around us, we've got two sources of information that we make use of. On the one hand, you've got all the information coming in from your senses, and we sometimes refer to that as bottom-up processing, but sometimes that information is either inherently ambiguous or it's degraded in some way. And in order to make sense of it, we also make use of what's called top-down processing. That's your beliefs, expectations, your knowledge about the way the world works. And these two kind of can be seen as interacting, being constantly updated with new information coming in from the senses to provide you with a mental model of the world and your place in it. Now, it follows from that when the information, when the stimulus is degraded or ambiguous, top-down processing has a larger influence. And that can result in us sometimes seeing and hearing things that just aren't there. Now, one particular example of this is something called pareidolia, a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. Now, we all experience this. One of the things that we're very likely to see in random visual patterns is faces. You know, you see faces in the clouds, you see faces in the stain on a floor, you see faces, you know, in photographs, and, you know. Now, most of the time we just say, oh, look, a face, and we have a little chuckle about it. But if it occurs in other contexts, like maybe a face apparently of Jesus in a church on wall, you know, in the stains on a church wall, people can sometimes place tremendous significance on that. So I've just got a few examples of people seeing faces in pareidolia. Obviously, it's relevant in terms of people thinking they've seen ghosts, or human figures and so on, because we're primed to pick up on these patterns. So here's a very famous example. This is a cinnamon bun that some people think bears a striking resemblance to Mother Teresa. So that's Nun Bun, the Immaculate Confection. If any of you can't see it, there's a nice, helpful little animation here. It is actually quite a good likeness. This is a more recent example. This is a grilled cheese sandwich that someone took a bite from and then thought they could see the Madonna looking back at them. So this is the Father, Son, and the Holy Toast. They put this on their bedside cabinet in a little container and 10 years later sold it, wait for it, for $28,000 on eBay. So it's worth keeping your eyes open. I believe it's now in a casino in Las Vegas. I mean, it's what she would have wanted, isn't it, really? I have to explain the caption for this one. This is a computerized tomography scan. Poor guy, only one testicle had dropped. And the medic who wrote up the paper said you could understand why the other testicle had not dropped, because would you want to share a scrotum with that? But again, it's a nice example of this tendency we have to see human faces in random visual patterns. Now, my favorite example, the most powerful one I've ever come across, of the power of pareidolia is in the auditory domain. It relates to the idea put about by certainly a lot of American Christian fundamentalists that there are hidden satanic messages in rock music, particularly rock music, but all kinds of pop music, really. But you can only hear this hidden message when you play the record backwards. Play it forward, you won't hear it. They still believe that it can influence you, so presumably they're worried that listening to these kind of records will lead good Christian children and teenagers into sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This is there are websites you can go to where you can play these backwards clips. And what's interesting is that typically you can't make out what the message is supposed to be until either someone tells you or you read it, and then you play it again and you think, oh, yeah, I can hear it now. Some of them are more impressive than others, but there has to be a top of the satanic pops. And in my humble opinion, it is this clip from Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. So what I'm going to do in a minute, I'm going to get it played backwards for you, and your task will be to tell me what the hidden message is. My prediction is that most of you will just think it sounds like backwards gobbledygook. There's a very good reason for that. It's because it is backwards gobbledygook. One or two of you might hear one or two words. I'll comment about that later. But I'm then going to tell you what the message is, and I'm going to play the same clip again, but it will sound completely different. You will hear the message as clear as a bell. You'll wonder how you missed it the first time. The reason you missed it the first time is because it isn't there. Okay? All right, so can we play the clip backwards, please? Okay, anybody pick up on any words at all? Satan! And again, that's top-down processing. I'm talking about satanic messages. What's the word you're most likely to hear? Satan. But according to people who believe this nonsense, this is the full message. It's a whole paragraph. Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666, supposedly the devil's number. There was a little tool shed, I can explain the tool shed, where he made us suffer. Sad Satan. Okay, now you've got the message in front of you. Can we play the clip again, please? I've heard that a million times and I never tire of it. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I think there will be time for a Q&A, hopefully. And just in case, I don't know whether I'd mentioned it before, I do have a book coming out. Okay, thanks very much.